Thank you very much, Sandy, and thank you all very much for coming. It's I can see both my teachers and my students in the audience, and it's a wonderful moment in life when that happens, I have to say. Thank you. Okay, so unlike me possibly, Mary Magdalene hardly needs an introduction. So I'll just give you a bit of dark space because there's going to be quite a lot to look at soon. So she is the woman out of whom, according to St. Luke, 7 demons were cast, the unnamed repentant sinner who anoints Christ's feet, the weeping figure slumped under the cross, and the first witness to the resurrection of Christ. She is the apostle of the apostles, who improbably washed up in Provence, the haggard woman in the desert, the composite saint of Pope Gregory the Great's oft-quoted sermon, who turned the mass of her crimes to virtues in order to serve God entirely in penance. All these manifestations have been the rich wellspring of Western art, and really Western rather than Byzantine. Mary Magdalene is not short of writers and debates, and in fact several major authorities on the subject are sitting in this very room, making me feel rather nervous. The range of studies focusing on aspects of her cult is so extensive that it can be intimidating approaching this topic for the first time. In our discipline, Mary Magdalene has been a platform for a myriad of fascinating discourses, both visual and scholarly, that go well beyond her oblique presence in biblical narrative. In popular culture, the range has been much greater in scope and quality, from memorable screen appearances over many decades, and some of you may have noticed posters springing up now in the new film of Mary Magdalene, to the conspiracy theorizing of the Dan Brown school of thought. On a purely scholarly level, it is fair to say that in the late medieval period, emphasis has largely been on the cult of Magdalene in the south, in Italy, and in her resting place in Provence. My engagement with this material in Central Europe began accidentally after encountering an intriguing piece of sculpture, which will be the centerpiece of my talk today, while working on rituals and monuments of relic displays in medieval Vienna. As this object represents Mary Magdalene in a uniquely different way, I began to wonder whether there is something genuinely different about the cult of Mary Magdalene in Central Europe. To add to this, my Leverhulme project is centered on the genesis of the late medieval city, as Sandy mentioned, through a comparative study of Prague, Vienna, and Krakow in the 14th and 15th centuries. And in the course of my research and travel, I started to look for instances of the saint's cult in urban context. What emerged was something distinctive which seemed worthwhile exploring. So, first image. For instance, during my visits to Budapest, I was struck by the prominence of the Church of Mary Magdalene in the heart of the castle. This was one of the 3 principal parish churches in the city favoured by the Hungarian population, and only 400 metres away from, though according to this famous view by Schedel, bigger and taller than the Royal Church of Our Lady, known as Corvinus' Church, the German, so these are the 2 spires of the church. Mary Magdalene's church may have been the poorer than its richly endowed neighbour, but this handsome 3-aisle building with a tall tower, rebuilt from the original single-aisle chapel, reflected a sense of civic pride. It played an active role in the municipal life of Buda, not only as a parish church, but also as an attractive backdrop to the markets held in its square on Saturdays and on the feast day of Mary Magdalene, it's like the 22nd of June. The urban theatricality of the setting must have been important, since the annual market day was a populous and grand event whose opening and closing was signalled by the ringing of the bells and raising and lowering of the flag. By the 15th century, the subservient relationship of Mary Magdalene to Our Lady's Church began to rankle. False accusations of plotting and intended appropriation of the eye-watering quantity of treasure amassed by the Corpus Christi confraternity in the Church of Our Lady quickly escalated into rioting and murder. The shocking events of 1439 resulted in a far-reaching institutional reform, which included conferring an equal parochial status on the Church of Mary Magdalene to that of Our Lady. The role of the Corpus Christi confraternity in this episode leads me to the next theme of this lecture, a close alliance between the most influential, as in Hungary, wealthiest of all medieval societies, and the cult of Mary Magdalene. In the case of Buda's splendid church, this association is tenuous, as Karoli Goda's research has shown. Nevertheless, Buda's castle was the stage for lavish corpus processions, which could involve not only the king, but as in 1412, an entire diplomatic corps of dignitaries. On those occasions, Mary Magdalene's church was one of the stations on the processional route. Such processing along an urban via sacra, which honoured its main municipal landmarks, is of course not unique to Buda. In the royal Polish seat of Krakow, here we are, another smaller chapel of Mary Magdalene occupied strategically superior position along the Grodzka Street, the Polish Via Triumphalis, which linked the old town with the royal and cathedral precinct on the Wawel Hill. And I should point out that this really is just a reconstruction because nothing is there. So we are, okay. So we are just here. This area here, there's the castle. From the late 14th and into the 15th century, every corpus procession in Krakow passed outside the east end of the Magdalene Chapel, before continuing towards the bridge and the new district of Kazimierz beyond. The construction of the chapel on this very spot was not a coincidence. It faced two older churches dedicated to St. Peter and St. Andrew, the latter one the oldest and most venerable among the oldest and most venerable churches in the city. The chapel, like the Magdalene herself, belonged in the city's apostolic zone, and among the saints who again, like her, were witnesses to Christ's life and miracles. But before I stray any further into Central Europe, I'll briefly return to Hungary once more in order to introduce the third strand of my argument, the cult of Mary Magdalene in the context of civic rituals of death and commemoration. In its present shell-like state, it is hard to imagine the original grandeur of the Church of Mary Magdalene in Buda and its contents. I wonder if among the altars and reliquaries it may have harboured funerary epitaphs similar to this exquisite object, now on this display in the Hungarian National Gallery close by. The relief is another example of innovative and emotive late medieval Passion iconography. It imagines a moving farewell between Christ and his mother. Christ blesses his mother while she, presumably full of foreboding, sinks to her knees and grasps his cloak. This dignified vision of a final parting from the loved ones, from the world, from one's own corporeal existence, would have had a deep resonance for the departed owner of the epitaph and for his family. The full implication of Christ's departure is made explicit by the proleptic pose of the Magdalene, who is the main witness to this scene. Her crossed arms do not only foreshadow the manner of Christ's death, but also her own gesture of despair under the cross. The relief originated in the Franciscan church in Nitra, which is now in Slovakia, and has a companion piece in a scene of the resurrection still in situ. As well as being a striking instance of Corvinian Renaissance, it had been stylistically linked with Vienna. Its closest relative was to be found in Herring Loy's epitaph for the Job Truxens von Wetzhausen in the chapel of the Teutonic Knights, near St. Stephen's Cathedral in the heart of medieval Vienna. Although the role of Mary Magdalene is here less visually striking, which is just about to make her out, sorry again, then in Nitra relief, the theme of triumph over death seen on this epitaph echoes an intriguing monumental relief which once looked onto St. Stephen's Cathedral. But as we move to Vienna, let me begin with the place before I turn to that object. The place is the square of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, now known as the Stephansplatz, but referred to in the Middle Ages by its ancient role as a cemetery, Stephansfriedhof. This area just beyond the breached walls of the Roman Vindobona developed into the city's religious nucleus, and by the 15th century it housed a vastly expanded Gothic cathedral. Despite its function as a stage for secular and religious events, including processions, theatrical performances, acrobatic shows, judicial courts, preaching, and even gambling, the square was only accessible through 5 gates, and many of its structures were directly linked to St. Stephen's functions and fabric. Immediately to the north stood the 13th century parish and provost residence, which became the Bishop's Palace in 1469, alongside the Zwetelhof and the Sovereign Mint. The south side was flanked by the parish school and the offices of the Cathedral Masons' Lodge. On the east side, the square was enclosed by the houses belonging to the chapter, some of them demolished in order to accommodate the extension of the Gothic choir. The southeast corner was dominated then, as now, by the headquarters, the Wiener Kommende of the Teutonic Knights. On the west side, facing the Riesentor, sorry, I just want to make sure this is a bit. So this range here, we looked at the north, south side, east side, so I'm just mentioning this range here. So on the west side, facing the Riesentor, the oldest part of St. Stephen's, stood in an even range of parochial offices, including those of the precentor, the sacristan, the church warden, and the undertaker, erected in the 14th and 15th centuries. Within this enclosed space, the cemetery, dating back to the antiquity, enveloped the church on the north, south, and east sides, and included a charnel, 3 stone lanterns for the dead, known as Totenleuchter in German. The Stephansplatz growing assembly of privately institutionally commissioned public monuments reached an apogee in the late 15th century with the rebuilding of the Mary Magdalene Chapel facing the cathedral's south side, and the construction of the relic display platform. So this is Mary Magdalene Chapel, and here's the Heiligtumstuhl. And this is one of these lights for the dead that you can see in the cemetery around. The platform, known in German as the Heiligtumstuhl, was erected northwest of the cathedral and modelled on similar semi-permanent structures that grace main squares of the imperial cities in Prague, Regensburg, and Nuremberg. In the place of their freestanding wooden platforms, the Vienna stone Heiligtumstuhl was an open loggia supported by an arch which simultaneously acted as a display platform and a gateway into the cathedral square. Except for the cathedral, all buildings and monuments I've just listed have since been destroyed or significantly altered. The unusual object I referred to a moment ago is a large stone carving shaped as a tympanum and dated stylistically to the middle decades of the 15th century, and indeed until recently displayed against this rather garish red background, for which I apologize. It's quite enervating to look at. It has been in the medieval collection of the Wien Museum since 1877, when it was removed from a house in Rotenturmstrasse, a street only a block away from St. Stephen's Cathedral. So this is the Rotenturmstrasse, Heiligtumstuhl, Mary Magdalene Chapel. According to the early 19th century sources, the relief was placed above the first floor window, which looked onto the house's inner courtyard. I will return to its mysterious presence there a little later, but in the first instance, I would like to focus on the tympanum's puzzling subject matter, so let's have a look at it again. The central figure is that of Christ stepping triumphantly from his sarcophagus-shaped tomb, holding a cross-shaped banner. The scene is witnessed by 5 sleeping soldiers and a female figure whose dress, loose hair, and the pyx resting by Christ's feet identify her as Mary Magdalene. Although unusually described as a resurrection scene, the presence of Mary Magdalene indicates a less straightforward iconography. The scene appears to show not the arrival of the 3 Marys, usually 3, though the number of women varies in the Gospels, but the event which, according to John, followed Mary Magdalene's return to the empty tomb with incredulous apostles. Having looked at the tomb, the weeping Magdalene spoke to the angels dressed in white, and she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing, and knew not it was Jesus. The configuration of space in John's account is not easy to fathom, but the reference to Mary Magdalene standing outside the tomb, the fact that she turned herself back and mistook Christ for a gardener, has led to the development of a specific noli me tangere, or do not touch me iconography, where the encounter takes place within sight, but spatially and psychologically away from the tomb. As a standalone image, noli me tangere emerged at the beginning of the 14th century, initially only in Italy. Even this briefest of surveys show that the Vienna tympanum does not fit neatly in the traditional sequence of events on Easter Sunday. It is neither the representation of the visit of the 3 Marys, nor a rare depiction of Mary Magdalene's return visit to an empty tomb, and thanks to Cecily Hennessy for this image, in the company of apostles, seen in this early Byzantine example, nor the familiar Noli Me Tangere iconography. Turning specifically to the rich theme of Central European examples, we find predominantly standardized representation, either the standalone moment of resurrection, as in this wonderfully uplifting example by Tamas of Kolozsvár, painted for a monastery in Apa, Hungary, which is now Slovakia, or its immediate narrative follow-up, the arrival of the perplexed Marys and the highly charged encounter in the garden, effectively condensed into a single scene on the wing panel of the Verdun altarpiece in Cloister Neuburg. In searching for earlier Central European models for the crossover iconography of the Vienna relief, an interesting blending of the Resurrectio and Visitatio Sepulchri occurs on one of the earliest known Bohemian panels belonging to the so-called Vichy Broad cycle. Here, three Marys appear as if actors who came on stage ahead of their cue, only to find themselves witnessing the moment of resurrection rather than staring at an empty tomb. Curiously, but perhaps in a direct homage to Vichy Broad, this motive reappears over a century later on the Reichard altarpiece, where we find again three Marys arrive at the resurrection, which, according to one catalogue author of the Reichard altarpiece, they cannot see. So they're kind of there, but they don't see it. Jaroslav Pešina's monographic study of the Vichy Broad's early 14th century panels, which are generally thought to have been made in Prague, suggested that their unusual iconography and some stylistic traits have come to Bohemia from Italy via the Danubian, so let's look at that again, via the Danubian region, which is the regional euphemism for Austria. More interestingly, perhaps, Pešina tentatively proposed a link between the Wimpled Marys of Vichy Broad and the Quam Querites plays named after the words of the angel de Sepulchre, whom do you seek, enacted by nuns of St. George's in Prague Castle since the 12th century. This tantalizing link between flexible iconography and devotional life of a nunnery is particularly fascinating because that brings us into the orbit of other novel visual and textual meditations on the resurrection developed for female houses in the Czech and German-speaking lands. Indeed, the surviving breviary of St. George's Nunnery of circa 1300 includes an officium with three set pieces: Mary Magdalene and another Mary visiting the empty tomb, Noli Me Tangere, and Apostles Peter and John at the tomb. None of these are obvious sources for the Vichy Broad panel. However, an important addition to the Easter officium was made early in the 14th century with the stipulation that the procession of biblical women approaching the tomb is to be led by Abbess Kunigunda herself, followed by the nun playing Mary Magdalene, then, confusingly, the three Marys, and the rest of the convent. Perhaps this strong institutional presence of women at the resurrection enacted at St. George's is registered in the Vichy Broad panel, but the object which speaks more closely to Kunigunda's distinctive and deeply mystical visualizing of the Passion is the famous Passional produced for her at St. George's in the first decades of the 14th century. Here the sequence begins conventionally enough on folio 14 recto, with the arrival of the three Marys at the empty tomb, followed by the encounter with Christ. Contrary to the Gospels, but closely adhering to Calder Colditz' treatise, all three women perceive him and simultaneously fall into proskynesis, led by the Magdalene, who surges forward in order to touch Christ's pronounced nail wound. Although Mary Magdalene's pride of place among the women is repeatedly stated, on the next folio she is upstaged by the Virgin, whose union with her son takes precedence. Following the visit, the three startled Marys bring back the news to the grief-stricken Virgin and Apostles Peter and John. Immediately below, we see the resurrected Christ embracing his mother, an image expanded on folio 16 on your right, into a tender mystical marriage. The Passional's iconography is illustrative of the sermons of the Dominican preacher and Kunigunda's spiritual advisor, Calder Colditz. However, the idea that Christ appeared first to his mother had a long extra-biblical tradition going back to the early church fathers. Commentators on the Bible, such as Rupert of Deutz and Durandus, believe that this was likely to have been true. It was omitted by the evangelists because a mother cannot be a witness for her son. A more explicit example appears in the Gradual of Gisela von Kessenbrock of circa 1300, when the Virgin is shown kneeling at the tomb itself. According to Judith Oliver, Mary, the witness to Christ's humanity, becomes a witness to corporeal reality of the resurrection. Mary Magdalene's meeting with Christ is represented on the facing folio, and her dress and pose mirror that of the Virgin, supporting Oliver's suggestion that the roles of Mary Magdalene and the Virgin fuse at Easter, or as St. Augustine succinctly put it, a virgin gave birth to Christ, a woman proclaimed that he had risen again, through a woman death, through a woman life. The roles of two women at Easter are so fused together that they appear at times to be interchangeable. In the 14th century Adamhausen gradual, it is Mary Magdalene, not the Virgin, who emerges with Christ from the tomb. Despite obvious parallels with Giesel's gradual, Catherine Boscombe's identification of the female figure as Mary Magdalene is not unreasonable, since the manuscript was produced for the Dominican convent of Mary Magdalene Freiburg. Moreover, the text of the gradual's introit, Resurrexi, refers to Mary Magdalene's role as the first witness of Christ's resurrection. My final two examples in this iconographic exposition show no such ambiguity, but also no obvious connections with Vienna. The first is this hanging in the V&A in London, either a frontal or a dorsal, chronologically closer to Vienna's Tympanum than the manuscript examples, and clearly takes the same approach to the resurrection. Nothing is known about its intended destination, except that it was probably used for an altar, and we can speculate whether a high-status chapel dedicated to Mary Magdalene would have guided such an intent reflection on the saint's role in the Passion narrative. She basically appears in every single scene. While it is difficult to relate the V&A hanging to the Vienna Tympanum, my second example, which I have only just discovered last week, provides a much closer regional precursor. The 14th century cycle of paintings in the parish church of St. Vitus in Coitus near Prague was first mentioned in 1878, but only fully uncovered and restored in 1999. On the south wall of the presbytery, 6 scenes follow the Passion of Christ from the crucifixion to Ascension. The choice and arrangement of the individual scenes has clearly been given some thought, but for my argument, the most striking element is the appearance of Mary Magdalene at the resurrection, which I'm sure you noticed. The iconography shows striking similarity with the Vienna Tympanum. Mary Magdalene approaches alone and from the left, and the sleeping soldiers are present, though fewer in number. The main distinction is that the saint is standing and holding the jar rather than kneeling, but there is no doubt that the encounter had taken place. As in Vienna, Mary Magdalene looks directly at Christ while he blesses her. So just to remind you what that looks like in Vienna. The physical isolation of this scene into a recessed alcove not only enhances its visual effect, but raises interesting questions about its function and how that may have informed this, for Bohemia at least, unique iconography. In scholarly literature, the alcove is unanimously described as a sedilia, but I am not convinced, and this is not having actually been in the building, but partly because looking at images of it, there seems to be another one, another sedilia that is further along east. So that lets me speculate further and wonder whether this may have served as a tomb for the unknown 14th century donor of the paintings, or for Vitus, the 13th century canon of Prague Cathedral and the namesake founder of the church. In the sepulchral contest, the choice of the subject matter may have served the same purpose as the resurrection epitaphs we began with tonight. Zuzana Wsiteczkova has dated Coitus painting to the 1360s on stylistic grounds, relating them especially to those at the Emmaus Monastery in Prague's new town, founded by Charles IV in 1348. Since Vienna under Rudolf IV was in many ways modelled on Prague, it is tempting to consider if those influences included a shared devotion to the Magdalene. Travelling in Charles's entourage as a young man, Rudolf caught the relic collecting fever, which would culminate in a great gift of relics to St. Stephen's in 1363 and enrich the religious life in the Stephansplatz. Following a precedent established in Prague, Rudolf's vast collection of relics became the subject of public veneration and regular display from the aforementioned Haltumstuhl erected west of the cathedral. But both for Charles in Prague and Rudolf in Vienna, the evidence of ardent Magdalene worship is not overwhelming. The visibility of Mary Magdalene in 14th century Prague initially owed little to the emperor himself, but much to his senior clerics, who, like the last bishop Jan of Dražice or the first archbishop Arnošt of Pardubice, had first-hand experience of Italy and the south of France through their extensive stays in Avignon, 11 years in Jan's case. Archbishop Arnošt in particular seemed to have formed an attachment to Mary Magdalene, as was directly responsible for the development of her cult in Prague. His so-called secret seals issued in 1344 and 1345 feature noli me tangere, two of only three surviving instances of this iconography of medieval seals, the third being that of the Benedictines of Vezele. He has been linked with the painted images of the Magdalene in the church of Kiev, near Prague, where her Assumption is painted above the figure of the archbishop, and also in the archbishop's palace in Rodnice. Jerzy Veit and Jan Reut surmised that the appeal of Mary Magdalene may have been driven by Arnošt's need to repent for his own sinful past, attested to by an encounter with a reproachful statue of the Virgin Mary in his youth. By contrast, the archbishop's biographer, Zdenka Hledíková, sees the saint as a metaphor for ecclesia, which demands constant repentance, but is also the herald of salvation, and by extension of archbishop's office. Nevertheless, the relics of the saint remained a rarity in Prague. The strands of her hair are mentioned in the cathedral inventory in 1355. This portable altar, made in Prague around that time, contains, among other relics of Mary Magdalene, and has been linked with the priest of Prague diocese, Jan of Strakonice, who was the chaplain to Charles IV in 1366. By 1370, a chapel was dedicated, there's an arrow pointing to it, to Mary Magdalene on the south side of Prague Cathedral choir, probably by the two canons who are seen on the far right of image on the right, who are seen on the chapel's votive painting being presented to the Virgin and Child by Mary Magdalene, St. Bartholomew and St. James the Less. This manifestly clerical devotion to Mary Magdalene steeped into royal projects only gradually. Mary Magdalene appears prominently in the Litany of All Saints in the coronation ordinal composed for Charles IV's Bohemian coronation, possibly as early as 1347. But his personal interest in the saint seems to have been ignited by the visit to Arles for his Burgundian coronation in 1365. The main trophy of that journey was the entire body of St. Sigismund, which was installed in the chapel next to the cathedral's sacristy, immediately opposite that of St. Wenceslas. So basically there, this is Wenceslas, and the sacristy is just here. More modest relics of Mary Magdalene were also donated to the cathedral treasury on that occasion. The so-called longer ritual of relic displays, which would have taken place every 7 years in the cathedral as part of the Jubilee celebration, has an entry for Imago Beate Maria Magdalene cum suis reliquiis, a reference to a lost gilded reliquary bust which would have been displayed from the balcony above the sacristy. So this balcony here originally had a kind of front bit there, but it burned down in a great fire in the castle in 1541. There is, alas, no evidence for that Mary Magdalene's relics were ever displayed in the main Prague relic festival, the Feast of the Holy Lance and Nails, which took place in Charles Square in the new town in the octave after Easter. And actually that display was from this spot here. However, Mary Magdalene is present in the square as part of the monumental biblical scenes painted in the cloister of the Emmaus monastery. This monastery is situated in the square's southern edge. In fact, you can see it just there. Played an important role in the Feast of the Holy Lance, possibly in the storing of the relics and in the post-display peregrination of the visitors who would have seen these images. Here, on the south side of the cloister, she appears as a penitent in the house of Simon the Pharisee, washing Christ's feet with her tears, wiping them with her hair, and anointing them with oil. Although the sinful woman performing this act of humility is not named in the Gospels, here she is clearly identified by inscription immediately below her, which says Magdalene. The identification of Mary Magdalene with a humble and a redeemed sinner would have resonated with pilgrims, including women, visitors to the Feast of the Holy Lance and Nails, with its strong paschal overtones and generous indulgences. And yet, the scene is unexceptional in that it neatly follows typological narrative of the Emmaus painted cycle, generously drawn from the Biblia Pauperum and the Speculum Humanae Salvationis. The Magdalene's humility is coupled with the two scenes, badly damaged, so now invisible really, showing Miriam stricken by the plague on the left, following Numbers, and making of offering for those stricken by the plague, following Leviticus, immediately on the right. In each case, sin and bodily suffering are equated, and redemption is delivered by the power of unquestioning faith. By 1365, Mary Magdalene's relics in a panel found their place among the phalanx of saints in Karlstein's Holy Cross Chapel, where the now indistinct scenes of her life, including Ernest of Pardubic's beloved Novelina Tangere, were placed in a window recess south of the altar of the imperial and south of the imperial version of the Grand Chasse, which was just here with the Passion relics. They're just there, but they really are so badly damaged that they make Emmaus Monastery look like it's just been finished. So, what connects Karlstein's scenes with other Bohemian examples mentioned here is that they were all wall paintings, Charles IV's preferred visual medium. They're also largely to be found in chapels or cloisters, which attest to a restricted viewing. An exception to my selective canon, and thus more relevant for Vienna, is the famous Last Judgment of the Teen Church in Prague. But here Mary Magdalene takes a usual place under the cross and is somewhat lost amidst the turmoil around her. My search for a significant Mary Magdalene church or a chapel in Prague, in a manner of those seen in Buda, Krakow and Vienna, yielded very little. The last bishop of Prague, Jan of Dražice, a prolific patron and builder, founded a convent of the Magdalene nuns in around 1329 in Prague's Mala Strana, not far from his own palace. But the sisters were clearly neglected. Documents from the early 15th century frequently plead poverty, and in 1439 the chapter was disbanded. The institution, which addressed more directly the spiritual needs of sinful women in 14th century Prague, was not instigated by Charles IV or his elite circles, but one of the city's rising number of firebrand preachers, Jan Milic of Kroměříž. Counterbalancing Charles's vision of Prague as an earthly Zion, Jan Milic founded Jerusalem in the notorious red light district known as Venice or Benátky, which was focused on reforming prostitutes. It's just this little area between the old and the new town here, near Bethlehem Chapel. So Jerusalem Chapel was dedicated to Mary Magdalene, following a pattern already found in Vienna, where a 13th century convent dedicated to Mary Magdalene existed outside the city gate known as Schottentor, and was devoted somewhat predictably to housing reformed women. Here it is, just that. In contrast to Prague, no explicit cult is evident at Vienna St. Stephen's in the first half of the 14th century. And despite the additional dedication of St. Stephen's Cathedral to all saints, I have found no relics of Mary Magdalene recorded in the earliest inventory of 1397, which included Rudolf IV's generous gift of relics. Perhaps understandably, Mary Magdalene's life had held no obvious attractions as a royal cult. But in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the fortunes of Mary Magdalene in Vienna experienced an about turn. Within the sacred enclosure of St. Stephen's, as we've seen, stood until 1781 an unusual 14th century chapel with a transept and an elongated eastern apse, built over a 13th century undercroft. So this is the kind of excavation report, as it were. There it is in one of the kind of only views of it. At the time of the construction of the upper chapel and its dedication to Mary Magdalene, the building had become the seat of the Notaries Guild, but in the 15th century it also became the headquarters of the prestigious Corpus Christi confraternity, with their Magdalene seal shown here on the right. Although the confraternity first appears in documents in 1347, It reached its heyday in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, counting among its members Emperor Frederick III and the cathedral's master mason, Anton Pilgram. One of the main tasks of the confraternity was the staging of the Passion plays and, concurrently, the largest relic procession in Vienna on the confraternity's feast day. On those occasions, the Magdalene Chapel and its crypt were used as a place of assembly and worship. While the simple three-bay layout of the 14th century chapel may have been dictated by the restrictions on the site, on the west side when it abutted the precentor's house, there was more space to the north. It was here on the chapel's cathedral-facing facade that additions were made in the late 15th century. This project was first mentioned in the 1473 will of the ironmonger Hans Wierech, who left money to it, and it is clear from its wording that the work had not yet begun. In the 1930s, Hans Tietze identified this drawing in Vienna's Akademie der Bildenden Künste as the design for the intended north porch. The drawing is not inscribed or dated, but shows clear stylistic links with the Singetor, the mid-15th century southwest cathedral porch. This design had been variously attributed, the design of the drawing, had been variously attributed to the three main architects involved in the cathedral in the 15th century, until Johann Joseph Böcker recent analysis of the style and method of drawing settled on Lorenz Spenning as its author. It is uncertain just how much of this sophisticated design was ever executed, but the surviving evidence is encouraging. Chapel excavations have revealed the existence of 15th century transept foundations on both south and north sides, while these famous views by Hofnagel and Huber show the 15th century elevation in its main outline and even, I hope I'm not just imagining this, some of its microarchitectural refinements. Ernst Bacher was so, this is the kind of particular detail I'm thinking about, harder to see there. Ernst Bacher was the first to postulate a link between the demolished Mary Magdalene Chapel and the Tympanum in the Wien Museum, focusing on the prominent presence of the titular saint at the resurrection and the similar dating of the sculpture and of the North Transept project. You will have no doubt already noticed that Bacher's argument also supported by the design of the new porch on the Akademie drawing, which accommodates a single portal with a tympanum. And so I have attempted, with enormous help from Robert Bork, to actually fit the proportions of the drawing, expanded proportions of the drawing, with the known proportions of the tympanum, to see, just for fun, whether they would fit. And clearly it's not easy. This is perhaps the most successful part, but bearing in mind that the sides of these objects have also been badly damaged. The tympanum thus unites in a single image the maid patron saint of the chapel and the Eucharistic cult of the Corpus Christi, and it is hard not to see it as at the iconographic centerpiece of the ornate porch. We can also imagine the tympanum being moved to Rotenturmstrasse after the demolition of the chapel. But in the adjacent article in the same volume as Bacher, Richard Perger put forward a rival argument that the tympanum belonged to the house chapel in Rotenturmstrasse, mentioned in the will of Hans Sager, the master of the Notaries Guild, whose seat was in Mary Magdalene Chapel. Clearly, Hans Sager's role as a linchpin between the house near Haltumstuhl, where the relief was eventually found, and the Magdalene Chapel is significant. But his house chapel was dedicated to the Holy Cross, which would suggest a different choice of portal iconography. Moreover, the sizable stone tympanum seems to belong in a public arena larger than a house. If we agree that the relief belonged to the chapel, it is an unusual resurrection of Mary Magdalene in Vienna's most hallowed ground, and where her cult had no standing tradition. But Mary Magdalene's ability to transform and adapt to different audiences made her an ideal choice for a chapel in a multifunctional municipal square. Some of you, many of you, will be familiar with urban and particular mendicant discourse on the cult of Mary Magdalene, exemplified by Catherine Ludwig Janssen's influential book, The Making of the Magdalene, and many others. The saint was not only an ideal subject for moralizing preaching that was blossoming in the cities across medieval Europe. She was frequently represented as a preacher, especially in her adoptive home in the south of France, and many thanks to Alexandra Gajewski for pointing out this image to me. It is easy to make a leap between this idea and the familiar image of the charismatic mendicant preachers operating in Vienna, such as the 13th century Berthold von Regensburg, or Franz von Retz, the Dominican active in Vienna University at the turn of the 15th century, or Stefan von Landskroner, the 15th century rector of the Church of St. Dorothy, or, of course, the impressively dynamic Johannes Capistran, largely known for his anti-Hussite and anti-Ottoman campaigns, but whose preaching often addressed the issue of male and especially female dress and decorum, accompanied by bonfires of vanities. Those star preachers could gather many thousands on major feast days and address their audience from external pulpits, such as this one, now much altered, originally placed amidst the graves of Stefan's Friedhof. Could this mendicant connection also provide some explanation for Mary Magdalene's unusual posture in the Tympanum? Should this be seen as another instance of contemplative Magdalene, praised by Christ in Bethany, the Magdalene who has chosen a better path, according to Luke, than her bustling sister Martha, and whose silent attention is example for all to follow? Scholars of Magdalene iconography in monastic settings have long argued for purposeful connection between her gestures under the cross and the modes of prayer advocated by the mendicants. The mendicant treatises such as the Modo Orandi and the paintings in the Dominican novitiate cells of San Marco in Florence, also of circa 1450, show the orant monk on his knees deploying a series of meditative gestures. Sadly, none of the recommended modes involves outstretched arms, a gesture for which I'm still to find a match, but which comes closest to the prostrate Magdalene in Abbess Kunigunde's Passion, which I'm showing just below. And thus, while public preaching provides an interesting contemporary dimension to Mary Magdalene's chapel in Stephansplatz, it does not give an explanation for its existence. We would otherwise expect more churches dedicated to the saint to have been cropping up in Central European towns, where Capistran and other preachers were particularly active. We have also seen that Dominicans showed some resistance to the idea of Magdalene as the first witness to the resurrection, and it is hard to see their direct influence in the choice of Tympanum's iconography. The fact that this is monumental sculpture rather than a painting is significant. It belongs in the centuries-old medieval tradition of portal sculpture, and its ability not only to register particular devotional interest, but to play a role in communicating and shaping them across urban landscape. The physical and cultural context, the location, audience, and devotional focus of such works is crucial for their understandings, as studies of many Romanesque and Gothic examples show. As is well known, the portals of high Gothic cathedrals could move seamlessly between biblical and local themes, and through this inner typology provide a monumental visual extension to verbal sermons, rituals, and sacraments that took place within. Stephen Murray has famously proposed the link between the portals of St. Firmin, Christ and the Virgin at Amiens Cathedral, and the sermons on obedience preached in the cathedral in the second half of the 13th century, arguing that it provided, as he said, a bridge between the complexities of biblical exegesis and the popular understanding of Christian truths. Just as a preacher provides an account of the rewards to be obtained in purgatory, argued Murray, the cathedral portals offer, quote, a kind of product guide to what is available inside. It has been amply demonstrated that it can also provide sacred parallels for the royal, judicial, communal, and religious events which took place on their doorstep. Because of their size, monumental sculptures could be placed strategically with a great deal of spatial calculation. At Amiens again, the celebration of the local bishop Saint Honoré on the south portal may have expanded the themes of local sanctity and the power of clerical authority introduced on the west facade by Saint Firmin. But it is also in Murray's word clearly responded to its public location, the large municipal avenue and the district populated by canons' houses. Barbara Aberhage has argued that similar spatial strategies and social upheaval shaped the iconography of Reims Cathedral's south portals. To my mind, a monument which manages to exploit its role as an urban landmark with remarkable aplomb is the Old Town Bridge Tower in Prague, which turns a mundane function of a bridge gateway into a celebration of the Luxembourg dynasty and the kingdom's patron saints within a compressed architectural diagram of the bridge and the cathedral which lay ahead. Interpreting monuments, their sequence, arrangement, and relationships can often give us a clue to the intended effect, even when its meaning is not always singular or fixed. Instead of looking for a meaningful plan that is either predetermined or articulated after the event, we should perhaps seek a different relationship between urban designs and their symbolism, one governed, in Krautheimer's words, and I have to say this carefully, by a network of reciprocal, half-distinct connotations. Krautheimer's language is weighted by his Neoplatonic approach, but it seems to strike the right tone. Thus, symbolic meaning is attached to certain forms, but their connotation is in Krautheimer's phrase dimly visible and not necessarily agreed upon. In other words, it can oscillate and change depending on the audience and the ritual. But are buildings a backdrop to the ritual, or can we say that architecture can suggest something specific, less dimly visible, to the choice of its tectonic and decorative forms and their interrelationship? In the case of Mary Magdalene Chapel, the appearance of the saint at the resurrection is not explicable exclusively in the devotional context of the confraternative Corpus Christi. More can be gained, I suggest, by looking across the three-dimensional space of the square and the rhetorical relationships developed across its now lost architectural landscape. The decision to commission a facade of this complexity for the Mary Magdalene Chapel may be connected with the increasing use of Stephansplatz as a stage for religious ceremony and with the desire to give its setting a suitable architectural decorum. The erection of the new porch with the Tympanum completed a series of important accents on the cathedral's south side, starting at the Apostles' Choir and its relic chamber, which is a relic chamber, Apostles' Choir, south transept in the tower, Cingator Porch, and Mary Magdalene Chapel immediately opposite it. So Cingator Porch is here, Mary Magdalene stood just there. So starting at the Apostles' Choir with its relic chamber, via the south transept and its majestic tower, and then continuing across the square to the Magdalene Chapel, whose most up-to-date architectural forms mirror those of the triangular Cingator Porch, conceived by the same architectural workshop. I would further propose that the meaning of the Magdalene Tympanum could be best elucidated through the scenography on the south side of Stephansplatz, and also through its important functions. While it must be acknowledged that it is not formed around a single idea or a program, the two dominant themes are regal and apostolic. Leaving the regal aspect aside for the time being, an apostolic theme is articulated through the relationship between Mary Magdalene Chapel Tympanum and the Cingator sculptural program. Here, the most prominent position is occupied by St. Paul, whose relics were donated to the cathedral by Rudolf IV in 1356. The scene of St. Paul's life, and especially the moment of conversion, which you can see just here, so this is inside there, are the main subject of the Cingator Tympanum situated within the porch. The saint reappears on the porch's west niche, here, addressing the viewers with a rhetorical gesture, while the central niche is occupied by the martyred St. Stephen. Mary Magdalene's status as the Apostola Apostolorum extends the apostolic theme of the cathedral's south side to her chapel and the tympanum situated directly opposite the Cingator. Moreover, the three events depicted or alluded to on the Cingator porch, and the resurrection tympanum inhabit the same temporal zone, since, as the Golden Legend underlines, they all took place within 12 months, and it says, St. Paul's conversion took place in the same year during which Christ suffered and Stephen was stoned, counting the year not in the normal way from January to December, but simply as a space of 12 months. A more profound theological concept linking St. Paul's, St. Stephen, and Mary Magdalene and their portal iconography is that they all experience life and death transforming theophanies. The importance of belief through sight is central to the ritual of relic display, which took place every Easter on the arch relic platform west of St. Stephen's, a ritual which now also included the relics of Mary Magdalene. The hair and the rib, I actually pointed them out to the two lost reliquaries as well, just here, up there, and another one just there. In the introduction to the Vienna Haltunbuch, a ceremonial book and inventory of the relics display, the visitors are urged to look at the Passion of Christ and the gains of his saints, so that they may arrive at the eternal land of our Father. Another critical sensorial response is that of touch, and the sense of physical presence is conveyed more strikingly by the corporeal 14th century figure of the Man of Sorrows, which you see here, situated on the corbel east of the Cingatur, who, with his dramatic gesture, perpetually beseeches the viewer to look at and touch his wounds. But instead of attempting to touch, Mary Magdalene in the chapel Tympanum opposite kneels in perpetual adoration at the Beata Visio before her. It is an image of ultimate consolation, situated amidst the graves of Stephansfriedhof and conveyed by the most humane of saints. Who ought to despair, declared Peter Damian, hopefully, when such a sinner as Mary Magdalene receive not only pardon but glory? She will intercede for your sins today and will return our judge, her bridegroom, placated to us. The prominent appearance of Mary Magdalene had a special meaning within the spiritual landscape of Stephansplatz. Furthermore, the decision of Vienna's richest and most prestigious confraternities to adopt her as their patron is clearly neither random nor eccentric. As in Buda and Krakow, the principal raison d'etre of the Corpus Christi confraternity was the staging of the processions and of the passion plays, where the role of Mary Magdalene would have taken on a special prominence. As Jan Anderson has demonstrated, Mary Magdalene's spiritual journey from a vain sinner to a privileged saint became more pronounced in the recorded German passion plays, including the 13th century Wiener Passionspiel, which were enacted outside churches, in town streets and squares. The Mary Magdalene Tympanum marks the apex of that trajectory and would have resonated with ordinary people of Vienna and with esteemed members of the guilds and confraternities who took part in those highly charged events. Ultimately, the mystery of salvation will only be revealed to those who repent and remain watchful. In the Tympanum, the sleeping soldiers, one actually shown with his back turned to us, are contrasted by the unflinching gaze of the adoring Magdalene. Like the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins displayed on cathedral portals, Mary Magdalene and the soldiers are a testimony to the imperative of moral readiness. High above the graves of Stephansfriedhof, and illuminated by the perpetual glow of the tall ciborium of the Totenleucht, the ever-watchful Mary Magdalene appears to answer the call of her fellow apostle, St. Paul. Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light.